Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me once again is Behnam Ben Taleblu, the senior director of the FDD's Iran program. Behnam, thank you so much for joining me.
Always a pleasure. Thanks. Good to be back with you, Brittany.
You and I had a conversation right before the first round of talks between U.S. and Iranian officials on Iran's nuclear program at the beginning of February. And I want to talk about where we are right now, the moment that we're in, as you and I sit here on Wednesday. Because this morning, Axios reported that a war between the U.S. and Iran was imminent. That is the word that they used. And we are, quote, closer to a major war in the Middle East than most Americans realize. And this reporting just comes one day after U.S. and Iranian officials met again in Geneva to talk about Iran's nuclear program. And reporting indicated that both sides said that progress was made in those talks. So to start off the conversation, what exactly happened between then and now and in those talks?
Well, certainly the Iranians have been trying to shape the information space after round two of nuclear negotiations in Geneva, talking about progress. But even stateside, we had Vice President Vance talk about the Iranians still not meeting in these talks, President Trump's red lines as it relates to the nuclear issue, let alone other matters. So I still think there's a big gap. The Iranians are going to be coming back allegedly to the table in about 2 weeks' time. And previously, President Trump has said he's going to give diplomacy at least a month. And we've seen already since President Trump's multiple promises in January to stand with the Iranian people, the U.S. force posture in the region changed considerably, be beefed up considerably, more assets, more air defenses, more ships, more destroyers, more carriers now, second carrier strike group on its way. So President Trump, I would say, as he's talking to Tehran, has been sharpening the knife against the neck of the regime's theocrats. And we'll actually have to see whether this is just an issue of military containment or a decapitation operation or a much larger military campaign that'll be sustained for weeks, as the Axios report is hinting.
You did touch on those comments from Vice President Vance, and I want to talk about them more fully, as well as compare them to something that an Iranian official said about the meeting, because the tone and the messaging seemed a little bit different. Iran's foreign minister reportedly said that good progress was made in these talks, and both sides came to a, quote, general understanding on a set of guiding principles. After the meeting, Vice President Vance was on Fox News, and he said that the Trump administration would like to resolve this through diplomacy, but all options were on the table. That's what he said. He also added this, quote, it was very clear that the president has set some red lines that the Iranians are not yet willing to actually acknowledge. So read between the lines, therefore. What exactly is Vice President Vance saying?
I think Vice President Vance is pointing to the past here, and the not too distant past. In 2025, we saw President Trump pursue multiple Iran policies almost at the same time. He had maximum pressure sanctions restored. He had indirect nuclear negotiations. He had military support to Israel. He had direct strikes against the regime's nuclear program. And he had multilateral support to American partners at the IAEA and, more importantly, at the UNSC to support snapback or the restoration of multilateral sanctions on Iran. He basically went through all options on the table in about 9 months' time at historic speed, and he was successful in almost all of them, I would say. So I think Vance wants the Iranians to take a look at the recent past to understand that time for diplomacy is not going to be unlimited. President Trump likes his military action like he likes his diplomacy, and vice versa, which is short, sharp, and decisive. And if the regime thinks they can drag this out again, well, then history will repeat itself, because President Trump committed to and lived up to, really, in his first year, all options being on the table. So I think he wants Tehran to understand politically and strategically that the president means what he says.
Is uranium enrichment one of those red lines? And if so, I mean, what does compromise really look like there? Because if the United States is saying you cannot have the capabilities to enrich uranium, you need to stop your enrichment program, Iran still wants the ability to enrich, where is the compromise there?
Well, first off, I have to say I don't think there's room for any compromise after the president said to the Iranian people that help was on the way, that they should be able to choose, different leaders. When he says "make Iran great again," when he says that he will hold those who engage in the crackdown responsible, when he tells Iranians to take over their institutions and keep lists of their oppressors, all of that stuff really erodes the room for continued diplomacy with the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism. But nonetheless, President Trump pivoted. He did pivot to bigger picture strategic issues, despite the massive crackdown from state against society in that country in the month of January. But even on those bigger picture issues, Brittany, despite the Islamic Republic taking a major beating and a loss in the 12-day war, the Islamic Republic is still keen to make President Trump pay for something that he achieved already for free. So the Islamic Republic isn't giving up uranium enrichment as a principle, even though it isn't currently enriching uranium because President Trump took away that capacity. Now, any kind of diplomatic agreement that follows needs to erode and remove that capability. And if the Islamic Republic isn't sincere about giving up that capability, well, then it's going to be the one paving the way towards more likely military action in the region. And the lesson of the 12-day war in 2025 was that which the Islamic Republic does not trade away, it will have taken away. And so I see very little room for agreements both on the principle as well as on the morals, but also as we get to the strategy. You know, if the Islamic Republic tries to run a play against Trump and say, okay, we won't enrich so long as you're in office, I don't think that will solve the problem at all. If the Islamic Republic tries to run a play and say, okay, how about we go back to the international consortium idea? I think taking a problem and multilateralizing and internationalizing a problem by adding more nuclear capacity into an already very troubled region is going to be the answer here either. This is going to be about the Islamic Republic surrendering, or it's going to be about the Islamic Republic being stubborn and potentially paving the pathway for another military conflict in the region.
What do you think is the more realistic outcome here? Because you did mention some of President Trump's comments, and I want to tack on some more. Aside from what you said of President Trump saying, help is on the way, we're with the Iranian people, make Iran great again. He also said before that Iran's supreme leader should be very worried. And last week he said that regime change in Iran would be, quote, the best thing that could happen. So, I mean, President Trump has some pretty tough words here. What do you think is the path forward?
I think actually President Trump has been negotiating in public, has been sharing his views and thoughts and values with the public and also the Iranian public and also Iranian leaders. I think President Trump means what he says. When he gave them 60 days, he meant 60 days. He said now 1 month. I'm sure he'll give them 1 month. President Trump, again, means what he says. And the funny thing is, it says more about us as a people trying to take apart those and actually say, no, he doesn't mean that, and projecting our current political orientation or current political preferences onto the president. But I think the mistake the Iranians made is that they projected more onto the president rather than read and understood what the president meant in time. So I think if Khamenei thinks that he's going to be safe or his regime is going to be safe, well, then he need only to look at President Trump's rhetoric and, more importantly, President Trump's record of matching his rhetoric to draw some real inferences here. Because I do think President Trump now, especially post 12-day war, sees the salience of the military option against the Islamic Republic. He's seen the Israelis since 2023 utilize successfully the military tool against Tehran's transnational terror network. And so the more the Islamic Republic does not play ball, the more attractive those options that President Trump has talked about is likely to become.
You've laid out before in our last conversation the potential military options here, and I want to talk about what you think they are now, 2 weeks later after that conversation, because reporting said that this wouldn't be like that in and out operation we saw at the beginning of the year in Venezuela, where the U.S. forces went into Venezuela, got Nicolas Maduro, and then came out. It would be what was described as a full-fledged war. So do you think that this would look more like that 12-day war between Israel and Iran, that the United States joined, dropped those bunker-busting bombs? What do you think the military action would look like, especially because, as we know, we're seeing that military buildup, the buildup of the military presence in the Middle East?
Well, the first thing I would say is that despite having a bigger military buildup in the region, an operation could still be limited. Lest we forget, there was a huge military buildup in the Caribbean, and you had a limited and targeted military operation. So the U.S. does like overmatch. The U.S. does like overmatch in every theater that it operates in. So just because you have a much bigger force posture in the region, that could be designed to contain the Islamic Republic, to limit the ability of it to threaten either international shipping or bases or Israel or other U.S. interests in the region. And therefore, just because America is bringing more into the region doesn't mean it's going to be using every single piece of hardware in the region. There's always the potential that this is a deterrent and to guard against the escalation prospects and to make sure that everything plays to America's favor. So I would not poo-poo and downplay the idea still in President Trump's mind of a potential decapitation operation. Second, I would say is that I think the most likely course of action, if I had to guess, and everybody's still guessing right now because President Trump is hedging, and therefore both allies and adversaries alike are hanging on to every tweet, every Truth Social post, every press statement to get an inference as to where U.S. policy will go, is that negotiations probably will not go anywhere. And then in the absence of those negotiations and their full breakdown, the U.S. is likely going to be able to at least pick up, and this is at least pick up where the 12-day war left off, which means targeting the regime's long-range strike capabilities like ballistic missiles, whether they're facilities, storage centers, launchers, underground depots, bases, as well as any kind of larger military infrastructure that engages in the procurement, production, or proliferation of those systems, as well as what's left of the nuclear infrastructure. And there, both America could do it solo, it could be joined by Israel, but you're likely going to see what I would call a defanging operation at a sheer minimum. And then the option exists to take that further and go against political targets as well as the apparatus of repression in the country, which is, again, that spinal cord of security that you and I have talked about, which is the IRGC, its basing structure throughout the country, the Basij, which is the paramilitary, which is part of the IRGC ground forces, the law enforcement forces, in particular, the special units, as well as the paramilitary and the plainclothes kind of vigilantes, groups like Ansar Hezbollah, as well as some of the foreign Shia militias that are operating on Iranian soil at the behest of this apparatus. And there's the opportunity to take that out, as well as the opportunity to escalate further and go after political targets and even political officials. So Trump has lots of options and lots of room for flexibility and escalation. The real $1 million question is, what does winning look like? As President Trump said, his end game with Iran is to win. What does winning look like? Does it mean a battered and bruised Islamic Republic, or does it mean paving the pathway for a post-Islamic Republic Iran? And I think the more military hardware we see in the region, the more the potential for something to be bigger and longer term.
To that point, what do you think winning looks like here as we sit here right now? And B, what do you think the timeline to winning is? Because I know Axios' reporting said that military action could be imminent. What does imminent really look like? Because talks are slated for in a couple of weeks.
It could be imminent, but if I had to guess here, I think President Trump will, again, if past his prologue, live up to what he said, which was the timeline that he slotted for negotiations, which was 1 month. I assume he will live up to that, like he lived up to the 60 days, quite literally on the dot, against this regime. But I think he wants the Iranians guessing as to what the political theory of the case will be, because they'll have a much harder time trying to counter that, whether that's at the negotiating table or whether that's on the battlefield. I personally think that there is no way out but through. This is a regime that has killed 36 to 43,000 of its own people in 2.5 days under the cover of an internet blackout that lasted 20 plus days amid the most massive protests this regime has experienced in the past 47 years. And that was a 3.5 week period of protest that touched every single one of Iran's 31 different provinces. So in my view, there is no deal that should be on the table to prolong the shelf life of the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism, which, by the way, currently has a bounty on President Trump's head himself. So for personal reasons, for strategic reasons, for moral reasons, I think the appropriate U.S. course of action is to stand with the Iranian people and to use military force to help pave the pathway for a fundamentally different type of government in Iran. And any strategy that is short of that will only inadvertently buy time for a major U.S. adversary in the region, and unfortunately lead to the loss of life of the most pro-American and the most pro-Israeli population in the heartland of the Muslim Middle East, and that's the Iranian people.
I do want to talk about just how strong or weak of a negotiating position Iran is in right now. And correct me if I'm wrong, it does seem pretty weak because as we remember, back in the summer, Iran went through that 12-day war with Israel. The United States did get involved. U.S. forces did drop some bunker-busting bombs on some of Iran's nuclear facilities. Those sites were damaged. Then Iran has a really weak economy, so weak that people went to the streets. They protested just how weak the economy was. It was in a complete downfall. Then you have Iran, the regime, being really unpopular, protesters coming out in full force against the regime in general. So what leg exactly do they have to stand on at the negotiating table?
Well, we've seen the Islamic Republic, unfortunately, be able to best conventionally superior adversaries, as well as other actors when it was outgunned, because, as President Trump has said, it never won a war but never lost a negotiation. So now we're at a format or in a medium, diplomatic talks that actually play to the very few advantages that the Islamic Republic has had and has been able to cultivate for the past 4 decades. But strategically, the one real tool the Islamic Republic is leaning back on is one, the West's fear of a contagion of conflict and potential spillover effects of a larger conflict, but B, ballistic missiles, because the regime is still home to the largest ballistic missile arsenal. And you see that the regime, whether they're political officials, religious officials, military officials, for the past month, month and a half, they have all been saying that they will internationalize the war. They will regionalize the war, even if there is a limited US military strike. That could be a gigantic bluff, or that could be the prelude to a much larger, costlier conflict. And that seems to be why the US is, again, hardening assets, bringing more forces in the region to be able to win those multiple rounds should the Islamic Republic choose to go big. I think militarily for America, the option really is go big or go home at this point in time. There's no, logic to turning on and turning off multiple cycles of violence and paying for it, and also having, again, the loss be really paid by that pro-American and pro-Israeli population, which is the Iranians here. But the Islamic Republic, long story short, has as the long pole in its tent of deterrence its ballistic missile arsenal. And the ability to do punishment and the ability to engage in damage by this arsenal thus far has kept other forces at bay. And that's really why the Israelis and the Americans have been zeroing in on this arsenal, particularly given not this recent trip, but the last trip that Prime Minister Netanyahu took to the US, which was in late December, where he basically received a pale green light to go after this. And the US actually spoke about ballistic missiles being a threat alongside the nuclear issue as well inside Iran. So the regime is unfortunately quite adept at the negotiating table. It's been able to turn losses into wins at the negotiating table, and it has a credible exit option, which is a costly regional war brought to you by this ballistic missile arsenal. And that's why, absent resolve, absent clear military capability in the region, it's not clear why we would pivot to a forum or an arena or a medium like negotiations that would favor the Iranians.
And I do want to talk about where the protesters are in all of this, because you and I, when we spoke at the beginning of February, I asked you how we went from talking and advocating for the protesters to sitting down with Iranian officials and hammering out, or trying to hammer out, a nuclear deal. What are they thinking right now? A, and B, I mean, especially what are they thinking when President Trump said last week a regime change would be the best thing for Iran? Do they feel like the United States has their back here?
Well, the goal of the government of the Islamic Republic, and this has seldom been discussed, one reason why this regime, which is thoroughly anti-American to its core, is still so keen to negotiate with America, and President Trump in particular, who again, it has a bounty on his head, is not just in the short term to deter and impede a potential military attack, and not just in the long term to get economic sanctions relief and foreign financial stabilization, but in the medium term, the Islamic Republic knows the biggest threat to its rule comes from an angry, disgruntled, and increasingly protesting population who has a clear, coherent ideology, which is their nationalism against the regime's Islamism. And the regime is trying to dishearten and downplay and render afraid and apathetic this increasingly large swath of anti-regime forces inside Iranian society. And they believe the best way they can do that is, whenever there are protests, unfortunately, to use such mass violence that is unprecedented in contemporary Iranian history, to literally shoot their way through the crisis. And then B, when the crisis subsides, to negotiate with the very actors that promise support to the Iranian people. So the goal of the regime has been to actually try to dishearten Iranian protesters by engaging with the very forces that promised help and support to the Iranian protesters. Thus, when you have as a split screen the 40th day anniversary of those who were killed in Iran being commemorated in mourning ceremonies and smaller scale political protests at grave sites just the other day in Iran, and then in Geneva you have negotiations between America and Iran, it's not a good look for America, especially given the mantle of moral leadership, and especially given President Trump's numerous promises. So the goal is not how to win the Iranian population. You've already won them over long ago. The goal is how do you not lose the Iranian population? And that's one reason why the regime has been so keen to negotiate, which is to take the wind out of the wings of the Iranian population. And therefore, if there ever is a resumption of hostilities and military conflict, then the regime would not have coterminously a foreign war and a domestic protest at the same time.
I know that you said that you think President Trump is going to keep his word on that month-long open negotiation. What are you specifically looking out for between now and then? Are we just focused on President Trump's Truth Social posts, what he says in press conferences and to the press about Iran? What specifically are you looking out for next?
Well, I'm also still paying attention to the debate in Iran, as well as what Iranian public officials are saying, and also what Iranian social media and what we can get through dribs and drabs of contact with the actual street in Iran are saying. The street, for example, in Iran, all eyes are trained on the skies. The diaspora, as you know, has been massively mobilized across multiple continents, protesting, hopefully trying to get more Western capitals and even Asian capitals involved in a pressure policy against the Islamic Republic and standing with the Iranian people. And then also when it comes to trying to figure out where U.S. and potentially European policy may go, looking at the public statements of these officials as well as, again, their social media accounts, because I think so much indeed is actually being telegraphed quite literally before our eyes.
Well, there's certainly so much to look out for, and I always appreciate your expertise and your perspective in these conversations. Behnam, you are welcome back anytime. Thank you so much for the time today.
Always a pleasure. Thank you so much, Brittany.